Some people never cry out for help. They don't fall apart loudly, and they don't collapse where anyone can see them. They simply come undone in silence, during the smallest hours of the night, in the very place where the whole world has turned its back on them. At 2:14 in the morning, Seraphine Lowell fell asleep from sheer exhaustion on the rooftop of the Verrault Theater, in the forbidden garden belonging to the most powerful man in New Orleans. When that cold-hearted kingpin stepped out of the darkness, instead of ordering her to leave, he bent down and caught the employee badge slipping from her hand, and something inside him that had long seemed dead suddenly stirred back to life. Far below, New Orleans was still wide awake, with the sound of jazz trumpets drifting up from the rain-dampened streets. But here, among the pots of nameless flowers, Sarah quietly watered every night after spending 14 hours on her feet cleaning. There was nothing left but the wind and a heavy silence. She was curled up on an iron bench, her hastily tied brown hair already slipping free. She had meant to close her eyes for only a minute, but her exhausted body and swollen feet hadn't given her any other choice. She had no idea that the glass door had just slid open behind her. The man who stepped outside carried the coldness of the night with him. Every evening, after the entire city had lowered its voice at the mere mention of his name, this was the only place Luca Ravenna came to, without bodyguards and without a phone. Because that garden wasn't his alone. It was all that remained of the little sister he had lost. His ash-gray eyes, the same eyes that had made even the hardest men bow their heads, now went still at the sight of the woman sleeping among the flowers that had belonged to the dead. He meant to turn around and go back inside. But then her time card slipped from her calloused fingers. For a single moment, the man all of New Orleans secretly feared stepped forward, bent beside a cleaning woman, and caught that inexpensive card as though it were something precious. He looked at her face, marked by a weariness no night of sleep could ever soothe, and quietly sat down. What Sarah didn't know was that the man sitting in the darkness didn't merely own the theater where she worked, and what Luca Ravenna never expected was that this broken woman, who had also once carried in her heart a child she couldn't save, was about to touch the very part of his humanity he believed had closed forever. At exactly 2:45, Sarah stirred softly. She opened her eyes and realized she wasn't alone. Before the story begins, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support us, and we hope you enjoy the story. In the first moment after opening her eyes, Seraphine Lowell didn't know where she was. She saw only the vast night sky above her, and the city lights flickering far below, and then everything came rushing back at once. The 14-hour shift, the rooftop garden, the iron bench she hadn't managed to leave, and the shadowy figure sitting silently in the darkness behind her. She sprang upright too quickly, her head still heavy with sleep that hadn't yet cleared, her heart pounding, one hand instinctively tightening around her time card, as though it were the only thing keeping her steady on her trembling legs. But strangely, amid all that panic, the first words that escaped her lips weren't an apology for herself, but the one thing her exhausted mind could still cling to. She stammered that she was sorry, that she had noticed the pot of jasmine in the corner was beginning to wilt, and she thought it hadn't been watered in 2 days, so she had meant to give it a little more water before going home. She said she hadn't known anyone else was up here, that this area had been closed for a long time, and that she should have gone downstairs hours ago. The man didn't move. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting motionless on the arms of the chair, as calm as though she were the one who had just entered a place that belonged to him, rather than the other way around. But the instant she mentioned the pot of jasmine, something almost imperceptible shifted in his ash-gray eyes, a stillness deeper than the one that had been there before, because for 2 years, no hand had been permitted to touch that garden, and the weary woman standing before him was the only person in all that time who had noticed that a flower was quietly dying of thirst. All she could make out was a tall figure, broad shoulders, and a motionlessness that unsettled her more than being shouted at ever could. Then his voice came, deep and unhurried, not as a question but as an observation. He told her she wasn't getting enough sleep. Sarah's legs were still trembling. She couldn't understand why a stranger would speak to her in that tone, as though he already knew something about her. She replied that she had only meant to rest for a minute, then took a step backward toward the glass door, and said she would leave immediately, that she was sorry for disturbing him. He tilted his head slightly, and the city lights illuminated half of his face. She didn't see the anger she had braced herself to face. He told her she had worked the night shift every day that week, and the week before that, and that she was always the last person to leave the garden. His words stopped her in mid-step. She looked at him, searching her memory for a familiar face, perhaps a guest she had once served without noticing, but she found nothing. She was certain she had never met this man, yet he spoke of her work schedule as though reciting something he had committed to memory. The question escaped her before she could stop it. How did he know those things? He didn't answer at once. He watched her for a long while, his gaze neither searching nor threatening, simply looking at her as though weighing how much of the truth she deserved to hear. Finally, he said that he noticed many things in this building. It was his job. She didn't understand what that meant, and part of her didn't want to understand, because there was something about this man that made her instincts warn her to leave as quickly as she could. Yet that very same thing held her there for 1 second longer. She was accustomed to powerful men walking into the places where she worked. Men who spent more in a single night than she earned in half a year. But this man was different. He displayed nothing, and yet the silence surrounding him carried more weight than all of them combined. She said softly that she hadn't meant to fall asleep there, that she was simply tired, speaking almost more to reassure herself than to explain. He replied that he knew, and this time, in those 2 brief words, she heard something she hadn't expected. It wasn't pity, but something closer to understanding, as though he, too, knew what it was to be so weary that no night of sleep could ever soothe it. She didn't know how to answer. Just then, the shift manager's pager vibrated in the pocket of her apron, pulling her back to reality. She glanced at the screen, then looked up and said she had to go. He gave a slight nod and told her, "Get home safely." She turned and hurried toward the glass door, still clutching her time card, but just before reaching it, she couldn't stop herself from looking back one more time. The man remained exactly where he had been, his back turned toward her, his face lifted toward the glittering city, alone beneath the vast sky, as though this were the only place in the world that belonged to him. She stepped inside and let the sliding door close behind her, carrying with her a question that repeated itself all the way down in the elevator. Who was that man, and why did he know so much about her when she hadn't even heard his name? Seraphine's apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Bywater, where the elevator had been broken for so long that she had grown used to climbing the stairs, even on nights when her legs were almost too numb to feel the steps beneath her, and she reached home just as the sky was beginning to pale toward morning, unlocking the door in the dark, and not turning on the light right away, because she had learned that every hour of brightness was another number added to a bill she couldn't afford. She took off her worn cleaning shoes and set them neatly beside the door, the way she always did, then sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long while without doing anything at all, only breathing, letting the silence of the small room settle around her. On the little kitchen table lay a stack of papers she had been trying not to look at for several days, and she knew exactly what was inside them without having to open a single one. Numbers that never grew smaller, but only larger with each passing month. Letters with bold print across the top that she had come to know by heart. The kind of debt that pressed down on her chest like a hand that never lifted. 2 years earlier she had once had a family, a home, a life she had believed would last forever, and then, in the span of a single night, all of it had been swept away from her, leaving behind an emptiness that nothing in the world could ever fill, and a debt she had never created, but was now the only one left alive to carry. She didn't let herself think too much about that night, because thinking had never once paid down what she owed, and tears could not be traded for rent money, and she had learned that lesson in the hardest way a person could learn anything. that the heart could break so completely a person believed she would not survive it. And yet the next morning, she would still have to rise, still have to go to work, still have to smile at strangers as though nothing inside her had shattered. The hardest part was not the exhaustion in her body, but the shape of the absence she carried, the space where a small boy used to be, an 11-year-old she had cared for and cooked for, and stayed awake worrying over, a child whose laughter she could still hear if she let herself remember. And so mostly she did not let herself remember, because remembering was a luxury that cost more than she had left to spend. She managed to sleep for a few short hours before daylight slipped through the thin curtain. Then she got up again and made a cup of weak coffee, ate something quickly just to have eaten, and began preparing for her afternoon shift. Because she worked 2 jobs, one cleaning the upper floors of the Verrault Theater through the long hours of the night, and one at a laundromat near her home in the afternoon, and between those 2 shifts there was almost no stretch of time that belonged to her alone. There had been people who offered to help her before, some of them with pity in their eyes and conditions attached to their kindness that she did not want to think about, and she had refused every one of them, because she had one rule she never broke no matter how tired she was or how humiliated she felt. She never begged anyone for anything. And she would rather climb 3 flights of stairs on swollen feet 1,000 times over than accept something that forced her to lower her head, because her pride was the last thing she had managed to keep after everything else had been taken from her, and she guarded it the way a person guards the final human part of themselves. Yet that morning, as she stirred the bitter coffee and watched the gray light creep across the table, she caught herself thinking about the man on the rooftop, and she did not want to. She told herself firmly that a man like that and a woman like her did not belong to the same world, that the whole strange encounter had been nothing but an accident that would never repeat itself, that she should forget it, the way she had learned to forget so many things. But his words kept returning to her all the same, the calm and knowing way he had said she did not sleep enough, the way he had spoken of her being the last to leave that garden as if he had read it somewhere and memorized it, and most of all those 2 quiet words, "I know," that had carried in them not the pity she was so used to bracing against, but something closer to recognition, as though somewhere behind all that stillness and that cold gray gaze, there lived a man who understood exactly what it meant to be tired, in a way no sleep could ever cure, and she did not understand why that thought, instead of frightening her the way it should have, stirred something in her chest she had not felt in a very long time. The highest floor of the Verrault Theater was a place very few people were ever permitted to enter, and those who were understood that each time they stepped inside, they carried with them a certain measure of caution, because the man who worked there did not raise his voice, and it was precisely that stillness that made men afraid. At 9 o'clock in the morning, while most of the city was only beginning its day, Luca Ravenna had already dealt with matters no one else would dare touch. Seated behind a long desk of dark wood, with the gray light of New Orleans spilling through the tall windows behind him, a man in a pressed suit stood before that desk, both hands clasped behind his back, his spine held straight, though his eyes did not dare meet Luca's directly, and he was explaining a sum of money that had gone missing from one of the establishments Luca quietly controlled, his voice growing smaller toward the end of each sentence, because he understood too well that in front of this man, every explanation became unnecessary. Luca did not interrupt him. He let the man finish speaking and then remained silent for long enough that the silence itself became a kind of warning, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not loud and not harsh, only calm enough to run cold through the blood, and it was that calmness that drained the color from the other man's face. He said that he did not care about the reason, that he cared only that the money be returned to where it belonged before the end of the week, and that this would be the last time the matter reached his ears, and the man nodded again, and thanked him, and backed out of the room so quickly he nearly collided with the door. That was how Luca's world turned. He rarely had to raise his voice, and rarely had to give an order twice, because his name did most of the work for him, and in the world he ruled, people spoke that name in lowered voices, not out of respect in the ordinary sense, but out of a fear rooted deep in them, the kind reserved for a man ruthless enough to make others wary, and intelligent enough never to leave a trace behind. A man who had built his position over many years, one cold and precise step at a time, turning a scattered and chaotic network into a smooth-running machine beneath a single hand, with the theater standing as only the polished and legitimate shell that concealed everything flowing quietly beneath it. And yet all that power could not buy him the one thing he actually wanted, and that was the truth none of the people who feared him ever saw. For the world looked at Luca Ravenna and saw a man who had everything, and it did not see that every night, when the machine finally stopped turning and the flatterers had all gone home, he returned to an emptiness that no amount of power could ever fill. He moved through that morning's work with his familiar sharpness, signing the documents that needed signing, making the calls that needed making, handing down decisions in which even the smallest error could make an entire organization tremble, and he did all of it without revealing the slightest emotion, because emotion was a luxury a man in his position was not permitted, and because he had long ago learned to bury what he felt so deeply that there were days he wondered whether he could still feel anything at all. But that morning something would not leave him alone, and it was not any of the matters weighing on his desk. It was the image of a cleaning woman, asleep on the last iron bench of the rooftop, and he did not understand why, of all the hundreds of people who passed through the theater each day, the only one who lingered in his mind was someone he barely knew, a woman whose name he had learned only from a time card, and whose face he had studied for far longer than he should have. He had once made people disappear simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and yet with her, the first thing he had thought was not how to make her leave but how to let her rest, and that troubled him, because in his world softness meant danger, and any attachment could become a blade turned back against him. What unsettled him most, though, was not that she had been sleeping in the one place meant to be his alone. It was what she had said when she woke, the words about a flower gone thirsty in the far corner of the garden, because that garden was tended by no one, guarded from every hand, kept exactly as it had been left, and in 2 long years not a single person who had walked past those pots had ever once noticed that one of them was quietly dying. No one except her, and he could not explain why that small thing, a woman half asleep worrying over a wilting bloom that was not even hers to worry about, had reached somewhere inside him that he had believed was sealed shut forever, and he sat alone in the tall, bright office, long after the man had gone, turning it over in his mind, unable to set it down. Royce Deacon was the night shift supervisor of the theater's cleaning crew, and he was the kind of man who only turned pleasant when someone needed something from him, because he held the small power of dividing the crew's wages and the pooled gratuities left behind by the private event guests at the end of each week. And he wielded that little authority like a weapon, keeping a portion for himself and distributing the rest in a way no one dared to question, since anyone who objected would find themselves handed the worst shifts the following week, or have their hours quietly cut until they could no longer hold on and left on their own. Most of the crew lowered their heads and let it pass, because like Seraphine, they needed the work far more than they needed fairness, and that night, just after her shift ended, Royce called her back to the supply counter, holding the folded stack of bills in his hand, and counting it out in front of her with a smile she had already learned to be wary of. He told her the week had been slow, that the private balcony event on the upper floor hadn't left as much as usual, and then he pressed into her hand an amount far smaller than what she knew she was owed, because she herself had cleaned those floors. She herself had seen the envelope the event coordinator had left at the end of the evening, and the number in her palm did not come close to matching it. She looked down at the money, then looked up at him, and instead of lowering her head and accepting it the way he expected her to, she laid the bills back down on the counter between them, and she said in a voice that was calm but clear that she had cleaned the entire upper balcony and both the east and west corridors that night, that she knew exactly how much had been left for the crew because she had seen it with her own eyes, and that she only wanted the share that belonged to her, nothing more and nothing less. The smile slid off Royce's face, because he was not used to being answered back by anyone beneath him, least of all by a woman working 2 jobs who so obviously needed every dollar she could hold. And he lowered his voice, and in that lowered voice was a threat that did not need to be spoken outright, as he reminded her that there were plenty of people willing to do her job, that she ought to know her place, and not make trouble for herself, because she was in no position to make trouble for anyone. Seraphine knew he was right about her circumstances. She needed this work, and losing it would mean the debt would close over her head that much faster, but she also knew that if she bowed her head this one time there would be a next time, and another after that, until there was nothing left of herself worth keeping. And so, she looked straight into his eyes without raising her voice, and without a single word of pleading, and she said that she was not asking for anything extra, she was only asking for what she had earned, and if that was what he called making trouble, then she no longer knew what the word fairness was supposed to mean. And when she finished speaking, she did not wait for him to answer. She counted out the exact amount she believed was hers and no more, left the rest lying on the counter, then turned away to gather her things, her back straight and her steps steady, not trembling at all, even though inside her chest her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. What she did not know was that the entire exchange had not escaped one pair of eyes, because at the far end of the darkened corridor that led toward the private stairwell, in the shadows where the overhead lights did not quite reach, Luca Ravenna stood perfectly still, with one hand resting in the pocket of his coat, and he had watched all of it unfold from beginning to end. He had not stepped forward and he had not made a sound. He had only watched, and as he watched he saw in that woman something he rarely encountered in the people who surrounded him, because most of them, when standing before power, even the petty little power of a man like Royce Deacon, chose to bow to stay safe, and she had not. She had stood there exhausted and poor with nothing in her hands to protect herself, and had still refused to let anyone take what was hers, and she had done it without shouting and without shedding a single tear. His gaze shifted from her retreating figure to Royce, who was gathering the bills back off the counter with the resentful expression of a man who believed he had just been stripped of something that belonged to him. And something very cold moved through Luca's ash-gray eyes in that moment, something that, had Royce seen it, would have kept him from sleeping easily that night. But Royce did not see it, and he had no idea that he had just done something the most powerful man in the theater had silently, and permanently, taken note of. The next morning, Royce Deacon received a call summoning him to the highest floor of the theater, and he went up there with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally caught the attention of those above him for good reasons, not for one moment imagining what actually waited behind that door. He did not remain at ease for long, because when the office door closed behind him, he found himself standing before a man whose name he had only ever heard spoken in whispers, a man that even the people ranked many levels above Royce did not dare mention carelessly, and Luca Ravenna did not invite him to sit. He let Royce stand there in the middle of the wide room while he slowly set down the sheet of paper in his hand, and that silence stretched long enough for sweat to begin beading along Royce's forehead, even though he still did not understand what was happening. And then Luca spoke, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not threaten in the crude way Royce used with the people beneath him. He merely said that he knew about the wages. He said he knew how Royce divided the gratuities, knew about the shifts that had been cut, and the veiled little remarks used to keep the crew afraid, and he named each thing one by one with such precision that Royce understood denying any of it would be pointless, that this man had known everything long before he ever picked up the phone to call him up here. Royce stammered as he reached for an explanation, trying to salvage himself by saying that it was only a method of management, that anyone in his position would have done the same, but Luca cut him off with a single sentence, saying that any man who used his small little title to drain the people who already had almost nothing did not deserve to keep that title, and that in his theater, he did not tolerate those who preyed on anyone weaker than themselves. There was a coldness in that voice that made Royce truly understand, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to stand before someone who could decide his entire future without ever needing to raise his voice, and he was told that from this moment forward he no longer worked at the Verrault. that every dollar he had kept from the crew would be returned in full, and that if he tried to make things difficult for any of the people he had once pressured, he would face consequences he was not strong enough to imagine. Royce left the office on trembling legs with none of the smugness he had carried in when he entered, and he disappeared from the theater that very day, so quietly it was as though he had never worked there at all. Seraphine knew nothing about that meeting, and when she arrived that evening to prepare for her shift, the first thing she noticed was that the air in the staff area had changed, that people were whispering among themselves that Royce had left, that no one knew the exact reason, only that he had gone suddenly and would not be coming back. And at the end of the shift, when the wages and the pooled gratuities were divided, she received exactly her share, complete, without a single dollar missing, and along with it came a repayment for everything that had been withheld from her over the previous weeks, handed to her without a word of explanation. She stood there holding the money in her hand, and a strange feeling rose inside her, because she had grown so used to everything in her life only getting worse instead of better, so used to having to fight for every small thing that belonged to her, that when something good arrived on its own, without requiring her to struggle for it, she did not know how to believe in it. She asked a few of the others who had decided this, and why Royce had left so abruptly, but no one could answer, or perhaps no one dared to, and that night, as she stood wiping down the last of the surfaces the way she always did, her mind drifted back toward the rooftop, toward the man who sat alone in the darkness among the flowers, toward the calm, deep voice that had told her he noticed many things in this building, and though she had no proof and no concrete reason to connect the two things, some quiet instinct whispered to her, just once, that this sudden change, this strange feeling of being able to breathe a little easier, was somehow tied to him, and then she pushed the thought away and went back to her work, because thoughts like that did not belong to a woman like her. It took almost a week before she went up to the rooftop again, and this time she was the one who climbed the stairs on purpose, though she would not have admitted that even to herself, telling herself instead that she was only going up there to breathe a little air before heading home, that after a long shift on her feet, it was a perfectly ordinary thing to stand for a few minutes and look out over the city, but somewhere beneath that careful excuse a part of her was hoping to find that shadowed figure sitting there again. And he truly was there, seated in the same place as before, his face turned toward the glittering sprawl of New Orleans, as though he had never once left that spot since the last time she had seen him, and this time she did not startle. She stepped out and let the glass door slide closed behind her, and stood still for a moment, not knowing what to say, and it was Luca who spoke first, not turning around, only remarking in a low voice that once again she was the last person to leave this floor, and in the words there was something that sounded almost like the faintest trace of amusement. She answered that perhaps the two of them simply shared a habit of lingering in places after everyone else had already gone, and she saw him tilt his head slightly, as though the sentence had touched something he had not expected, and for the first time she thought she caught the barest edge of a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before it appeared. She moved a few steps closer, close enough now to see him more clearly in the light rising from the streets below, and she still did not know his name, and still did not know who he was. But she was no longer afraid of him the way she had been that first night, and she found herself instead watching him, studying the small details, the way he sat with his back straight but not rigid, the way his two hands rested quietly, the way his gaze reached far into the distance while seeming not to truly look at anything at all. She had met many powerful men in the course of her work, and they had all carried the same kind of energy, a loudness even in their silence, a need to be seen and noticed by everyone around them, and this man was the exact opposite. He did not need anyone to notice him. He seemed almost to want the world to leave him entirely alone, and that was precisely what made her more curious than anything else. Without quite meaning to, she asked him why he came up here every single night, and the instant the question left her mouth, she was afraid she had crossed a line she had no right to cross, and he was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer at all. But then he said, still without turning to look at her, that this was the only place in the entire building where no one needed anything from him, where no one was waiting for him to make a decision, where no one wanted to take something from him. The sentence was brief, but it revealed more than he had likely meant to say, and inside it she heard a loneliness so deep that it made her pause, because she had assumed that a man with power like his, a man the whole city seemed to fear and respect in equal measure, must have everything, must be surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to stand beside him, and yet sitting here in this moment, he looked less like the owner of everything below, and more like a man who did not have a single person left to talk to. She realized, almost with a quiet surprise, that perhaps he was lonely in the very same way she was lonely. Only his loneliness was hidden behind power, while hers was hidden behind work. And she did not say that out loud, because some things did not need to be put into words. She only stood there with him a little longer, two strangers from two completely different worlds sharing a stretch of silence they both seemed to need. And when the pager in her apron buzzed again to tell her it was time to go, she hesitated a moment before turning away, and this time, before stepping back inside, she stopped and told him quietly that she hoped he would find some place where he could truly rest. Not only an empty rooftop at midnight, and she did not wait for him to answer, but as the glass door closed behind her she had the feeling, though she did not see it, that the man had just turned his head to watch her leave. In the days that followed, Luca found himself thinking about her last words more than he wanted to admit, because no one in all these years had ever said anything like that to him, that they hoped he would find some place where he could truly rest, since people spoke to him about money and about power, and about problems that needed solving, and about men who needed to be dealt with. But no one had ever once cared whether he was tired, whether there was any place at all in his life where he could simply breathe, and she had said it to him, a woman who owed him nothing, and had no reason to care, and she had said it not to flatter him, but simply because she truly meant it, and he was so accustomed to kindness, that came with a purpose attached that kindness with no purpose at all, left him unsure where to place it. He began to notice her in a different way, not with the cold attention of a man who controlled everything inside his building, but with a kind of focus that felt unfamiliar even to him, and so he had someone look quietly into her circumstances, discreetly, through channels that left no trace, and what he learned left him sitting in silence for a long while. He learned about the 2 jobs she worked, the theater through the night and the laundromat through the afternoon, learned about the distance she traveled each evening to return to an apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Bywater, learned about a debt pressing down on her shoulders from a disaster 2 years earlier that she had not caused, and yet was the only one left alive to carry. And he learned that she climbed 3 flights of stairs every single night because the elevator in her building had been broken for longer than anyone could remember, that she had never once asked a single person for help, that she had refused offers other people in her position would have seized with both hands. The more he learned, the more he saw in her something he had rarely encountered in his entire life, a self-respect that could not be bought, a resilience that did not announce itself, a woman from whom life had taken almost everything, and who still refused to let it take her dignity, and in his world, where nearly anyone could be bought or bent or broken by money or by fear, a person like her was almost impossible to imagine. So he decided to do something, and he did it in his own way, quietly, without letting her know, arranging for the long broken elevator in her building to be repaired, not through some grand and obvious command but through a short call and a discreet arrangement made along channels no one could ever trace back to him. And he did not want her to know it was him, and he did not do it to be thanked. He did it because he could no longer bear the thought of her dragging her swollen feet up 3 flights of stairs every night after 14 hours on them, when he, with a single word, could bring that particular misery to an end. A few days later, he heard back through one of his people that the elevator was working again, that the residents of the building could not understand why the landlord had suddenly agreed to fix something that had been broken for so many years, and that a woman on the 3rd floor had stood there in front of the lit elevator for a long while, looking at it as though she could not quite believe her own eyes, and when he heard that, something very rare appeared on his usually cold face, not exactly a smile but a faint softening at the corners of his eyes. He did not fully understand what was happening to him. He only knew that it had been a very long time since he had done something for another person, without calculating the benefit, without weighing what he stood to gain, without seeing it as a move on a board. And the simple act of making one person's life a little easier to breathe, without needing her to know, and without needing anyone at all to know, gave him a feeling he had believed he would never be able to feel again. And that night, when he went up to the rooftop and did not find her there, he realized with a kind of unease he was not used to, that he was waiting, that for the first time in many years, there was someone whose presence made his long nights feel a little less empty, and he did not know whether he should be glad of that or afraid of it. There was a reason Luca had chosen this rooftop, and not any other place in the whole of the Verrault, a reason he had never told a single living soul, and perhaps never would. Because many years earlier, back when the theater was still being restored, and half its floors sat empty and unfinished, he had brought a young girl up to this very rooftop one warm afternoon, a girl of about 19 with the same dark hair as his own, and a laugh that could melt even the hardest ice buried inside him. Her name was Delphine, and she was his little sister, the child he had raised in place of both a mother and a father after their parents were gone, taking her small hand in his when he himself was barely more than a boy, and promising, without ever saying it aloud, that he would keep her safe from a world he already knew to be cruel, and she had grown up beside him not knowing the true shape of the things he did, only knowing that her brother would move the earth itself before he let any harm come near her. Delphine loved growing things in the way that only certain rare people love them, gently, and without any expectation of reward, and it was she who had first carried the empty pots up to this bare stretch of rooftop, she who had hauled the bags of soil up flight after flight, while he shook his head and laughed and carried half of them for her, and it was she who had planted the very first seeds in the very first pot, telling him that a place this high up, this close to the sky, deserved to have something living on it. He still remembered that afternoon, with a clarity that ached, remembered her kneeling in the dirt, with soil on her hands, and the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, remembered her pointing down at the lights of the city, spreading out far below them, and asking him, with the bright and absolute faith of someone who still believed the world was mostly good, whether all those glowing points were stars that had somehow fallen to the earth, and he had not had the heart to tell her they were only streetlights, so he had said yes, they were stars, and she had looked at him as though he had just confirmed something she had always known, and that was the kind of person she was. Someone who could make a man like him say that streetlights were fallen stars, and half believe it himself. And then life, which had never once been fair to anyone, not even to the most powerful men, took her from him when she was only 19 years old, took her in a way that all his money, and all his power, and all the connections that could buy nearly anything in the world, were still not enough to prevent, and he had not been able to keep her, he who had promised himself he would always be able to keep her, and that was what had broken something inside him that never once healed. After that, he could not bear to be inside the large and echoing home they had once shared, where every corner held some small reminder of her, and so he had come here instead, night after night, to the one place where he still felt close to her, because she had built this garden with her own hands, and something of her still lingered in it, in the soil and the leaves and the quiet, and if he closed his eyes and let the wind pass over him, he could almost hear her laughter drifting back to him from an afternoon that had long since disappeared into the distance. He kept the garden exactly as she had left it, every pot in its place, and he had it tended in secret so that nothing in it would ever die, because letting even one of her flowers wither felt like losing another small piece of her, and that was why, on the night he had stepped out and found a stranger sleeping among those pots, his first instinct should have been anger, and instead something else entirely had stirred, because the exhausted woman curled on the iron bench had woken and, before anything else, before even fear for herself, had worried aloud about a jasmine gone thirsty in the corner, And in 2 long years not one person had ever noticed that flower. No one except the little girl who had planted it, and now this woman, who could not have known what any of it meant, who could not have known that she was standing inside the last remaining piece of everything he had loved and lost. And he did not understand how, but she had reached straight through all of it to the part of him he had buried right alongside his sister. The night they met again on the rooftop, something between them had shifted, perhaps because she had sensed the loneliness in him the last time, or perhaps because he himself, after everything that had stirred back to life inside him, no longer raised his familiar wall as firmly as he always had, and they sat beside each other, not too close, both of them looking out over the city, and this time, it was Seraphine who broke the silence. She told him that she knew what it felt like to lose someone she had believed would stay beside her forever, and she said it not to pry into him and not to draw sympathy from him, but only because, for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself, she felt that this man would understand, and he turned to look at her, and in his eyes she did not see the guardedness she had once seen there. She saw only a quiet waiting, as though he were giving her permission to continue, and so she did. She told him that 2 years earlier she had once had a family, had once had people she loved more than she loved herself, and that in the space of a single night, all of them had been swept out of her life by something she still could not think about without feeling her chest tighten around itself. And she did not tell him the details, because there were kinds of pain that did not grow any lighter for being spoken of in detail, that only tore the wound open again, and he did not ask for them, because he understood that better than anyone alive. She said that after that night she had not only lost the people she loved, but had been left carrying an enormous debt she had never created, though she was the only one still living to carry it, and that from then on, her life had become nothing but one shift after another, dollars counted and recounted, nights spent returning home in the dark to save every small bit of electricity, and she said there had been times when she wondered why she still kept trying at all, why she did not simply lie down and let it be finished, but that she always found some reason to rise the next morning, even when that reason was nothing more than a stubborn refusal to let life defeat her completely. He listened to her from beginning to end without interrupting even once, without offering any of the hollow comfort people usually reach for when they do not know what else to say, and when she finished, he did not tell her he was sorry, and he did not tell her that everything would be all right. Because he knew those words meant nothing to a person who had lived through what she had lived through, and instead he said, very quietly, that he understood, and that single word, coming from a man she already sensed would never say anything he did not truly mean, carried more weight than all the comfort she had been offered in the past 2 years combined. She looked at him, and in that moment she understood that the man sitting beside her was carrying a wound very much like her own, a loss he also could not put into words, and that this was why, from the very beginning, she had felt he was different from everyone else, and neither of them needed to say it aloud. Still, somewhere in that shared and wordless silence, they both recognized the same truth, that each of them had once tried with everything they had to shelter a child from a cruel world, and that each of them, despite everything, had not been able to hold on. That recognition, unspoken and complete, created between them a bond that no words could have made any stronger. That night, after she had gone back down and the rooftop was empty again, Luca remained seated alone for a very long time, and for the first time he admitted to himself what he had been refusing to admit for weeks, that this woman had become important to him in a way he had never expected and had not chosen, that he, the man who had spent so many years building a wall around himself that no one could pass through, the man who had so carefully kept everyone at a distance where they could never reach far enough to wound him again, had somehow allowed one person to step inside, and he understood exactly what that meant in the world he lived in, where every attachment could be turned by an enemy into a weakness, where the moment a man revealed there was someone he was willing to protect, he handed his enemies the single most dangerous thing he owned. And he knew all of this, and yet for the first time in a very long time he felt that here, at last, was something worth the risk. For several weeks, Luca had carried a feeling he could not shake. The kind of feeling that anyone who survived long enough in his world learned never to ignore. The sense that something was wrong beneath the quiet surface of everything. And at first, it was only small details. So small that a less careful man would have overlooked them entirely. A shipment arrived later than it should have, with no explanation that anyone could give to his satisfaction. And then a meeting he had arranged with great discretion was somehow known before it ever took place, though only a very small number of people had been aware it was happening at all. And a few figures in the ledgers did not match in a way that was far too subtle to be an honest mistake. And each of these things on its own could have been explained away by carelessness or bad luck, but Luca had never once believed in coincidence, and when those small details began repeating in a pattern that only the eyes of a man who had spent his entire life recognizing patterns could see, he understood that he was facing something far more dangerous than someone's simple incompetence. He understood that someone was moving in the dark, someone intelligent enough to hide his own tracks, patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment, and most troubling of all, someone close enough to him to know things that only an insider could know. And that was what chilled him most, because a threat from the outside he could handle. He had handled threats like that his whole life, and had never once lost, but a threat from within, someone who had sat at the same table with him, someone he had trusted, someone who understood how he thought, and how he arrived at his decisions. A person like that was dangerous, in an entirely different way. He began to watch the people around him with new eyes, quietly taking note of every reaction, and every glance, and every unnecessary moment of hesitation, and he told no one at all about his suspicions, because he knew the traitor, whoever it turned out to be, would be watching just as carefully to see whether he had noticed anything, and his only real advantage now lay in making that person believe he still knew nothing. His mind returned, almost against his will, to Royce Deacon, that small and petty man he had removed for preying on the crew, and a thought rose in him that he could not confirm but could not dismiss either, because when he had first looked into the matter he had noticed, without paying it much attention at the time, that Royce had not clawed his way into that supervisor's position on his own, that someone above him had quietly smoothed the path and placed him there, someone who had indulged his small cruelties and looked the other way. And Luca now found himself wondering whether a man like Royce, someone skilled at nothing more than frightening people weaker than himself, had truly been acting alone, or whether behind his recklessness had stood someone larger, someone who had used him as a pawn in a game Royce himself was not even capable of understanding. He had no proof of any of it, only instinct, but his instinct had been sharpened by far too many years for him to take it lightly, and he felt with a clarity that was almost physical that those small incidents, and Royce's quiet placement, and something much larger hiding behind all of it, were pieces of the same picture. A picture he had not yet seen in full, and he sensed that it was leading toward a conspiracy larger than anything he had faced in a very long time. A conspiracy not meant merely to take his money or his territory, but to take everything, to pull him down from the position he had spent his entire life building. And so he did what he had always done best. He showed nothing at all. He moved through his days with the same familiar sharpness, gave the same orders in the same even voice, let everyone around him believe that the great and watchful eye of the theater had noticed none of it, and beneath that calm surface he began, quietly and patiently, to set his own net, drawing it out one careful thread at a time, waiting for the hidden hand to reach just a little further and reveal itself, because he knew that whoever it was would eventually make a move, and when they did he intended to be ready, and what he did not yet know, what not even his sharpened instinct had warned him of, was that the hidden hand had already found the one thing that could hurt him, and it was not his money and not his territory, it was a woman who watered flowers on a rooftop at midnight. The man behind it all was named Gideon Marsh, Luca's right hand of many years, the one who had stood beside him through so many seasons of rise and ruin, and who had been trusted so deeply that almost no one in the organization would ever have thought to suspect him. Gideon had been with Luca since the earliest and leanest days, had watched him build everything from almost nothing, had helped him remove rivals and secure the loyalty of the wavering, and because of all that history, he understood Luca better than anyone else still living. But that very understanding, the thing that should have been the foundation of an unbreakable loyalty, had instead become the seed of a slow and patient betrayal, because for years now, Gideon had quietly nursed the belief that he was the one who truly deserved to sit at the top, that his own contributions had never been properly repaid, that he had done most of the heavy and thankless work, while Luca received all the glory and all the fear that came with the name. Then the girl had been lost, the little sister, and Gideon, watching his boss from the closest possible distance, had seen something he had long been waiting for, without daring to hope. He had seen Luca change, had seen the man who once left no opening at all now disappear every single night onto an empty rooftop, had seen the cold and flawless sharpness of the old days sometimes give way to distant, wandering silences, and Gideon had convinced himself that grief had worn the man down, that the terrifying figure he had once served had been hollowed out from the inside, and that now, at long last, the time had come for him to seize what he believed had always rightfully been his. He had spent many quiet months preparing, placing his own people into key positions where no one would think to question them, and one of those small pieces set carefully on the board had been Royce Deacon, a crude and greedy little man Gideon had lifted into the supervisor's post, precisely because a man like that, hungry and stupid and easy to control, made a useful pair of eyes and ears down among the crew, and when Luca had removed Royce so suddenly and so completely, Gideon had felt the first cold prickle of alarm, because he had understood at once that his boss did not remove a man over stolen wages, that Luca had acted over something else entirely, and it had not taken Gideon long to learn what that something was. Through his own careful watching, through the discreet observation that was his particular gift, Gideon had discovered that Luca no longer spent every night on that rooftop alone the way he once had, that a woman had entered those lonely hours, a cleaning woman who worked in the very theater, at the heart of everything, and he had seen the way Luca moved differently around her, had traced the quiet removal of Royce back to her, had even uncovered the silent repair of a broken elevator in a shabby building across the river that no official order had ever authorized. And to a patient predator like Gideon, those signs told him everything he needed to know. He understood that this woman, though she herself knew nothing of it, had become the single most precious thing to Luca since the loss of his sister, and that if there existed any way at all to break a man who otherwise seemed impossible to break, it did not lie in attacking his empire, but in reaching for the fragile heart he had only just allowed to open again, and a cold and satisfied smile spread across Gideon's face when he realized he had at last found the leverage he had been searching for all this time. And there was something else, something that even Gideon himself found darkly fitting when the pieces of it settled into place. Because as he began to look more closely into the woman's past, into the disaster that had taken her family from her 2 years earlier and left her drowning in a debt she had never earned, he began to sense the faint and buried outline of his own hand in it, a protection racket he had once run through intermediaries far enough removed that no one would ever connect it back to him, a chain of events he had set in motion long before he had ever heard this woman's name, and he understood then that the very woman Luca had come to care for had already, without either of them knowing it, been touched by the same darkness he now intended to use against them both, and he did not feel guilt at the discovery. He felt only the cold pleasure of a man who believed the board had finally arranged itself entirely in his favor. It began with small things, small enough to unsettle Seraphine, but not enough for her to understand what was truly happening, because one evening as she came out of the theater after her shift, she had the distinct feeling that someone was following her, a cold sensation crawling along her spine that made her turn back again and again on the walk toward the bus stop. But every time she looked over her shoulder, all she saw were empty streets and shadows with no clear shape to them, and she told herself she was only too tired, that her exhausted mind was inventing things that were not there. A few days later, though, a man she had never seen before approached her while she stood waiting beneath the flickering light of the bus stop, and he spoke to her in a tone so polite that it ran cold through her blood, calling her by her correct name, Seraphine, as though they were old acquaintances, mentioning the third-floor apartment where she lived, mentioning both of the jobs she worked and the hours she kept at each of them, laying out the small private details of her life one after another as though to make certain she understood that he knew all of it. He did not threaten her directly. He did not say a single thing that could have been repeated to anyone as a clear warning. But everything in the way he stood and the way he looked at her, and the unhurried way he told her that she ought to be careful about the kind of people she allowed into her life, made her understand, with a certainty that needed no proof, that this was a warning, and then he simply turned and walked away into the dark, leaving her standing there alone, with her heart pounding, and her hands beginning to tremble. She went home that night and locked the door tightly behind her, and sat in the darkness for a long time, unable to understand why any of this was happening to her, because she had lived the past 2 years as quietly as a person possibly could, trying never to draw anyone's attention, trying only to survive one day and then the next, and yet now, suddenly, some strangers knew everything about her, who followed her through empty streets and warned her about things she did not understand. In the days that followed, the pressure only grew heavier, because she began receiving calls from numbers with no name attached, nothing but silence on the other end of the line before it went dead, and then she discovered something that frightened her more than any of it, that the debt she had been struggling to pay down little by little, the debt she had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat, had suddenly been bought up by some outside party she had never heard of, and that the terms which had already been harsh had become, almost overnight, far more severe in a way she knew was not normal, as though some invisible hand had reached in and deliberately begun tightening a rope around her throat. She began to understand, though she still did not know the whole truth of it, that none of this was accidental, that some hidden hand was pulling the strings behind all of it, turning her already difficult life into something almost impossible to bear, and what hurt her most, what kept her awake staring at the ceiling night after night, was that she could not understand what she had done to deserve any of it, because she was not powerful, and she had no money, and she had no enemies, nothing at all that should have made anyone in the world want to target her. And yet, lying there in the dark, one thought rose slowly to the surface and would not sink back down, a thought she did not want to have and could not push away, that all of this had begun only after a certain man had entered her life, the quiet man from the rooftop, whose name she still did not fully know, the man whose world she had always sensed was a dangerous one. And she understood then with a sinking certainty that whatever shadow had fallen over her had not come because of who she was, but because of who she had allowed herself to grow close to, and that the only person in the world she felt might be able to protect her from it was the very same man who had, without either of them ever intending it, brought it down upon her in the first place. In the long nights that followed, Seraphine lay awake and began to think about something she had not allowed herself to consider since the day she first rebuilt her life in this city, and that was leaving, because she had pieced together enough of the scattered fragments to understand a truth that twisted her heart, that the danger now falling over her had nothing to do with who she was, and everything to do with the man from the rooftop, with the fragile bond that had grown between them, with the simple fact that she had let someone like him step into her life, and though she still did not know exactly who he truly was, she understood enough to know that his world was a dangerous one, a world she did not belong to, and that by coming close to him she had somehow made herself into a target for shadows she could not even see. That thought tormented her through hour after sleepless hour, and one part of her, the part that had learned long ago to protect itself, by never letting anyone come too near, urged her to do exactly what she had always done whenever life turned dangerous, to gather the few things she owned into a single bag and disappear, to slip away to another city and begin again, from nothing one more time, to cut every thread that had the power to drag her under before it could pull tight, because she had done it before, and she knew, with a weary and practiced certainty that she was capable of doing it again, and a quiet voice inside her kept repeating that this was the only wise thing left to do, that staying would bring nothing but ruin, that she had no right to pull anyone else down into the swamp of her own cursed life. But there was one thing that made her hesitate, one thing she had not expected and did not know how to handle, because for the first time in 2 long and hollow years, she did not want to leave. For the first time since she had lost everything, there was someone in the world who made her feel that she was not entirely alone in it. Someone whose quiet presence made her cold nights feel a little less cold. Someone who had looked at her not as an exhausted cleaning woman or a miserable debtor, but as a person with worth, a person deserving of respect and of care. And that rare and precious thing, the very thing she had never dared to hope she would find again, was now the thing she was being asked to give up. She was torn between the 2 choices, and with every night that passed, the struggle grew more painful, because she knew that if she stayed, she would not only place herself in danger, but might well become the very weakness that put him at risk. And the thought that her presence could bring harm to the one person who had shown her genuine kindness was more than she could bear to hold. And yet she also knew that if she left, she would return once more to the loneliness she knew far too well, and that this time, it would be colder than it had ever been before, because now she knew what it felt like not to be alone, and a person cannot forget warmth once they have finally been warmed by it. She thought that perhaps leaving without a word was the best way, the only way, because she knew that if she stood before him and let him look into her eyes and ask her why, she would not have the courage to walk away, and so she began, quietly, to prepare, folding the few clothes she owned, counting what little she had, turning over in her mind where she might go, and every small act of that preparation made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe, and she told herself that she was doing this for him, to protect him from the very danger she had accidentally brought into his life, that sometimes loving someone meant having to leave them. But even as she said these things to herself, she knew, deep down in the honest and unguarded core of her, that she was lying to herself in part, that she was also running because she was afraid of how much that man had come to matter to her, afraid of what would happen to her heart if she stayed and then lost one more person she had allowed herself to love. Luca knew what was happening to Seraphine even before she fully understood it herself, because in his world, very few things could happen without eventually reaching his ears, and when he pieced the scattered fragments together, he understood the entire shape of the picture that had been carefully woven around her, understood that the traitor had found his weakness, and that his weakness was the woman he had allowed into the lonely hours of his life, and the anger that rose inside him at that realization was unlike any anger he had ever known, cold and deep and quiet, the anger of a man who had already lost too much, and now watched the last thing he had left being reached for by hands in the dark. In the first moments, every instinct sharpened over so many years in his world urged him to answer in the only language that world had ever understood, to find the men who had dared to approach her, and to deal with them, and everyone standing behind them in the most final and merciless way he was capable of. And he had the power to do exactly that, the men, and the means, and the name that would have made it simple, and he knew that if he unleashed the full weight of what he was, there would be no one left afterward who could so much as speak of her without trembling. But then, right in the middle of that cold and rising fury, something else reached out and held him back, because he thought of her, of the way she had stood before Royce Deacon, with nothing in her hands to protect herself, and had still refused to lower her head, of the way she had rejected every offer of help that came with conditions attached, of the quiet and unbreakable dignity she had carried through everything life had thrown at her. And he thought of the words she had said to him on the rooftop, that she hoped he would find some place where he could truly rest, and he understood, with a clarity that struck him almost like pain, that if he let his anger turn him back into the monster the world already believed him to be, then he would become exactly the kind of thing that she, if she ever came to know it, would never be able to look at again. And for the first time in more years than he cared to count, He stopped before a line he once would have crossed without a single moment's hesitation, because there were ways for him to extinguish this threat that would drag innocent people down along with it. Ways that would give him everything he wanted and cost him the last remaining human part of himself, the very part she had somehow reawakened. And he refused to take those paths. He decided instead that he would protect her, and that he would trace the traitor to his source, and unmake his entire scheme, but that he would do it without betraying the one principle that had always separated him from those who were purely and simply brutal, the principle that he struck only those who deserved to be struck, and never the innocent caught in between. It was a far more difficult choice, and he knew it, because it meant he would have to move with more precision and more restraint than raw vengeance would ever require, would have to hold his fury on a tight rein instead of letting it lead him, would have to place her safety above even the roaring hunger for retribution in his chest. But he realized, with a surprise that unsettled even him, that this was in fact the man he wanted to become, not the hardened thing that grief had made of him after he lost his sister, but something closer to the brother who had once carried bags of soil up a stairwell and laughed while a girl planted her first flowers against the sky. So he called upon the small handful of men whose loyalty he trusted absolutely, the ones who had proven themselves over long years, and he began to prepare quietly, arranging for Seraphine to be watched over from a distance, discreetly enough that she would never once sense it, making certain that wherever she went, there was always someone nearby to keep her from falling into the wrong hands. And at the same time he began to draw his net closer around the hidden figure, following every trace the traitor had tried to bury, patient and exact, and utterly without mercy toward the guilty, and he did not yet know that while he was pouring every ounce of his strength into keeping her safe, she herself, believing she was protecting him, had already begun quietly preparing to vanish from his life. In the days that followed, Luca worked with a cold and focused concentration that even those closest to him rarely witnessed, following each thread in the web the traitor had spun and patiently loosening one knot after another until the picture gradually came into focus before his eyes. Having every suspicious transaction examined again, every leaked meeting, every figure that did not match, and clue by clue they all led in the same direction, toward the same man he had not wanted to believe could be involved but could no longer bring himself to deny. When the name Gideon Marsh finally stood out plainly as the answer to everything, Luca sat in silence for a very long while, and inside that silence was a kind of pain he did not allow himself to show, because Gideon was not a stranger, and not an enemy from outside. Gideon was the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone else alive, the man to whom he had once given an almost absolute trust, the man he had once regarded as something close to a brother, and betrayal from a man like that cut deeper than any blade an outsider could have driven into him, and Luca, who had believed himself long since hardened against every possible form of treachery, discovered that there were still wounds even he was not immune to. But the deeper he dug, the more he uncovered things that turned the blood cold in his veins, because as he traced Gideon's hidden dealings back through the years, following the quiet operations the man had run through layers of intermediaries, far enough removed to keep his own hands clean, Luca began to touch something he had never expected to find, a faint and buried thread connecting this traitor to the very disaster that had taken Seraphine's family from her 2 years earlier, a chain of events Gideon had set in motion long before either of them had ever heard her name. He could not confirm every detail, and part of him did not want to believe what he was piecing together, but what he found was enough to make him understand that Gideon, through his schemes and the men he had used as his instruments, had once been tangled, indirectly, and from a great and deliberate distance, in the sequence of things that had pushed that woman into the tragedy that shattered her life. And that truth, though it remained blurred and incomplete at its edges, brought Luca a deep and quiet shock, because it meant that his fate, and hers, had been woven together by the same man, the same source of darkness, long before any chance had ever brought the two of them to a rooftop garden in the middle of the night. He did not let that shock throw him off his course, and if anything, it only made his resolve turn harder than steel. Because now he was no longer fighting merely to protect her from a present danger, he was fighting to close a circle of darkness that had gone on far too long, a circle into which he himself, without ever knowing it, had also been drawn, and he understood with a terrible clarity that the same hand which had once reached into her life to break it was now reaching into his to do the same, and that if he did not stop it here and now, it would go on breaking everything it touched. So he began to tighten the net around Gideon Marsh, quietly and deliberately cutting off each of the man's escape routes, neutralizing the people he had planted in key positions, winning back the loyalty of those who had begun to waver, until the power the traitor had spent so many months secretly accumulating began to crumble in his hands before he even fully realized it was slipping. But Gideon was no ordinary opponent. He had survived in this world long enough to sense when the ground beneath his feet was beginning to shift, and when he understood that Luca had not grown weak as he had so badly misjudged, that the man he intended to overthrow still possessed every ounce of the old and deadly sharpness, he understood that his own time was running short. Driven into a corner from which there was no clean escape, Gideon decided to play his final and most dangerous card, the one he had prepared in advance for exactly this kind of moment, deciding that if he could not defeat Luca through patience and schemes, then he would force the man to his knees by striking at the single thing he could not bear to lose. And so, while Luca was drawing his net ever tighter, Gideon quietly gave the order to his men, aiming it straight at Seraphine, and the long and hidden war between the two of them turned at last into something open and direct, a final confrontation that both men understood only one of them would walk away from whole. Gideon's men found Seraphine on the very evening she had chosen to leave the city, just as she had locked the door of her third-floor apartment for what she believed would be the last time, carrying a single small bag that held everything she meant to take with her, and they stopped her before she could reach the main road, and this time, there were no more polite warnings and no more quiet strangers at bus stops, only the cold and businesslike efficiency of men who had been given an order. She struggled against them and she called out, and she did everything a person in that desperate situation could do, but there were several of them, and they were stronger, and she was forced into a waiting car and driven through the dark to an old warehouse standing on the edge of the city, near the slow black water of the Mississippi, where Gideon Marsh was waiting with the calm expression of a man who believed the game was already firmly in his hands. He watched her being brought in through the wide doors, and across his face spread the satisfied smile of someone certain he had finally secured the one card that would force Luca Ravenna to surrender everything, and he told her, almost gently, that she was not the one he wanted, that she was simply the price of something larger, and that if the man she had grown so fond of behaved sensibly, then perhaps no harm would need to come to her at all. But what Gideon had miscalculated, once again and for the last time, was the speed and the reach of what Luca was willing to do to protect this woman, because the men Luca had quietly set to watching over her had never once let her out of their sight, and the very moment she was taken they knew, and the moment they knew, he knew, and he moved with a decisiveness Gideon had left himself no time to anticipate. When the warehouse doors were thrown open, it was not with a knock, but with sudden force, and Luca stepped inside with the small handful of men he trusted absolutely, and in that instant, the man whose name had made the entire city lower its voice had returned in his most complete form. Every trace of the distant and grieving figure of recent months burned away, leaving only the cold and total focus of a man who had come to take back what was his. The confrontation that followed unfolded quickly, and in near silence, Gideon's men moving to block them, and a struggle breaking out across the dim and open floor of the warehouse, shapes colliding in the half-light, sharp sounds ringing out against the high metal walls, the whole of it resolving in a matter of moments, rather than the drawn-out chaos Gideon had imagined he could rely on, because the men Luca had brought were few, but they were the best he had, and they moved with the quiet certainty of people who had done difficult things before and did not flinch from doing them again. Through all of it, Luca moved with only a single purpose fixed in his mind, to reach her. And nothing in that warehouse was going to stop him, because he had spent his whole life in situations shaped like this one. But tonight, there was something entirely different at its center. Tonight, he was not fighting for power or for territory, or for the survival of the organization. He was fighting for one person. And that was what made him impossible to turn back. And for the first time since the night he had lost his sister, he placed his own safety into danger, without so much as a heartbeat of hesitation, crossing straight through the center of it all. And in that moment, he felt something rise in him that he had not felt in a very long time, the feeling that his life once again held something worth risking everything to protect. Gideon, watching the battle he had been so sure of collapsing into ruin all around him, tried to pull her in front of him, tried to bargain, tried to threaten, but the cold confidence that had carried his voice only moments before had begun to drain out of it, and Seraphine, held there in the middle of everything she did not understand, saw through the dim light the figure of the quiet man from the rooftop cutting steadily toward her, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for days finally cracked open, because she understood, without needing anyone to tell her, that he had come for her, that whatever else this man was, whatever dark world he belonged to, he had come, and he was not going to let her fall. Gideon pulled her closer to him and tried to use her as his final shield, holding her in front of himself as the last of his men fell back and the open floor of the warehouse emptied of everyone but the two men at the heart of it. And he tried to bargain, saying that Luca would let him walk out of here if he ever wanted to see this woman unharmed. And he tried to threaten, saying that one wrong move would cost Luca the very thing he had come to save, but the cold confidence that had always carried his voice was gone now, and in its place was the thin and brittle edge of a man who had gambled everything and finally understood, too late, that he had misjudged the board from the very beginning. Luca stopped a short distance away and did not rush, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, quieter even than usual, and that quietness was more frightening than any shout could ever have been, because he said that Gideon had made only one real mistake in all his years of patient scheming, and it was not the shipments or the ledgers or the leaked meetings. It was that he had reached for the one person Luca would burn the entire world down to protect, and he said that he had spent his whole life believing that grief made a man weak, and that Gideon had believed the very same thing, and that both of them had been wrong, because grief had not made him weak, it had only shown him at last what was worth fighting for. What passed between the two men, in the moments that followed, was quiet and final, a reckoning years in the making, between the one who had betrayed and the one who had been betrayed, and when it was over, Gideon Marsh was no longer in any position to threaten anyone ever again. His schemes unmade, and his power scattered, and everything he had spent so long building collapsed into nothing around him, and the warehouse fell silent, and the only sound left was the slow water moving somewhere beyond the walls and the ragged breathing of the woman standing frozen in the middle of it all. Luca crossed the now still and open space toward Seraphine, who stood there trembling, still unable to fully believe what had just unfolded before her eyes, and he stopped in front of her, and for one long moment, the two of them only looked at each other without speaking, every word made unnecessary by the sheer weight of everything that had just happened. And then he reached out his hand toward her, a hesitant and almost uncertain gesture from a man who was not at all used to tenderness, who had spent so many years keeping every other human being at a careful distance that he no longer quite knew how to close one, and she looked at that offered hand, and then she looked at his face, and she stepped forward and fell into his arms. And for the first time in 2 long years, Seraphine allowed herself to cry in someone else's embrace, allowed herself to be weak in front of another person, allowed herself to believe, if only for this one moment, that there was someone in the world who would not let her fall. And all the grief, and all the fear, and all the crushing loneliness she had carried alone for so long, finally broke loose and poured out of her, and he held her there in the middle of that emptied warehouse with one hand resting gently against the back of her head, steady and unmoving, letting her fall apart against him without asking her to be anything other than what she was in that moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice, the same voice that had made hardened men lower their heads and drained the color from the faces of those who feared him, was no longer cold at all. It was low and unsteady, trembling in a way he did not even try to hide, and he told her that she was safe now, that no one would ever be able to reach her again, that it was over, and she pressed her face against him and held on, as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had spent 2 years trying to sweep her away, and he did not let go, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither of them was alone. A few nights after the storm had finally passed, after every danger had been extinguished and the city had settled back into its familiar rhythm, Luca brought Seraphine back to the rooftop where everything had begun, to the very garden where he had first found her asleep on the last iron bench. And they stood beside each other in the warm night wind and looked out over the lights of New Orleans spread far below them, and this time there was no guardedness left between them, no wall that needed to be raised, and she asked him the question she had wanted to ask for so long, why he came back to this place every single night, and this time he did not turn it away. He told her, in a low and unhurried voice, about the little sister he had raised in place of both a mother and a father, about a girl named Delphine who had loved growing things and who had carried the first empty pots up to this bare rooftop with her own hands, because she believed a place so close to the sky deserved something living on it, and he told her how life had taken that girl from him when she was only 19 years old, in a way that all his money and all his power had not been enough to prevent, and how after that he had closed off a part of himself because he did not believe he had the strength left in him to love someone and then to lose them all over again. And he told her that for years he had come up here every night, not to find peace, but only to stay close to a memory, to remind himself that there had once been a time when he was a different man. And then he looked at her and said the thing he had never said to anyone, that on the night he stepped outside and found her sleeping among those flowers, worrying even in her exhaustion about a single bloom gone thirsty, he had recognized in her a loneliness exactly like his own, and that she, without ever knowing it, had reminded him that pain was not something a person had to carry entirely alone. She listened to all of it, and tears rolled quietly down her cheeks, not because she was sad but because she understood that two broken people had somehow found each other in a vast and cold world, and that sometimes what saves us is not strength at all, but the courage to let another person step into the weakest parts of ourselves. In the months that followed, both of their lives slowly changed, in ways neither of them would once have dared to imagine, because the debt that had weighed on Seraphine's shoulders for 2 long years, the thing that had chained her to one endless shift after another, was finally untangled. Not through a gift that forced her to lower her head, but in a way that respected the dignity she had guarded through everything, and for the first time, she could breathe without feeling the weight of those numbers pressing against her chest, and she reduced her hours, and began to sleep enough, and began to rediscover the small things she had long forgotten she once loved. And the face that had always been marked by exhaustion gradually brightened with a light she herself had nearly forgotten she possessed, and one quiet afternoon, she knelt in the rooftop garden and planted new soil around the withered jasmine in the corner, the very flower that had started everything, and coaxed it slowly back to life. As for Luca, the man whose name had once made the whole city hold its breath, he too began a journey of change of his own, quietly withdrawing from the darkest parts of the world he had once ruled, undoing one tie to the shadows after another, not in a single night, and not easily, but one deliberate step at a time. Because he had finally found a reason to become a different man, a reason far better than all the power he had ever held, and he came to understand that what he had once believed was strength, the ability to make others afraid, had never truly filled the emptiness inside him, and that the simple, small act of caring for another human being, and being cared for in return, was what had finally brought him back to the part of himself he thought he had buried forever. And so on the very rooftop that had once been a lonely refuge for each of them, they found something else now. Not a place to flee from loneliness anymore, but a place to begin again, together. Their story is a quiet reminder that kindness, the kind that asks for nothing and needs no one to see it, has the power to save both the one who gives it and the one who receives it, and that no matter how much life takes from us, the possibility of healing remains, as long as we are brave enough not to carry our pain alone. If this story touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video, so that together, we can keep listening to more meaningful stories like this one every day. And we would truly love to know how this story made you feel. So please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because there is nothing we treasure more than hearing your voice. And to everyone watching this video, we wish you good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in each passing day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.